Okay, well, look, I might kick off. So, thanks for joining us. This is a webinar forum. Just to do a few housekeeping matters. If anybody on the call wants to ask a question during the presentation, you'll notice up in the left-hand corner of your screen, top left, there's a microphone icon. If you just click on that and turn it green, you can ask a question. Alternatively, you can also type a question down in the chat box down in the bottom right-hand corner. The other thing you can do is there's a little raise your hand icon up at the top of the screen. You can use that as well if you want to just let me know that you've got a question to ask. Stop. So look, let me introduce myself. I'm Brett Staines. I'm a board member on the Fire Protection Industry Board for ODS and SGG. I've been in the fire industry for about 30 years now. For 7 or 8 years, I was in the industrial fire protection area. I was a fire chief and fire protection engineer at Caltex at the refineries in Sydney up until the mid-90s. And since about 1995, I've been heavily involved in gaseous suppression systems, their design, commissioning, installation, maintenance, and so on. I'm also quite active in the technical writing space for Standards Australia and also Fire Protection Association Australia. I'm the chairman of a couple of their special hazards fire protection committees. So I've got quite a broad background, I guess, and certainly have enjoyed participating in the Fire Protection Industry Board over the last dozen years or so. So, well, what we're going to be talking about this afternoon is about 3 licenses, EAHLs we call them for shorthand, Extinguishing Agent Handling licenses, and the license numbers 2, 3 and 6. And I thought the best place to start, just as a bit of background or to set the scene for this stuff, is why do we have these licenses and why do we have different regulations and so on about ozone depleting substances and synthetic greenhouse gases. So it really revolves around the ODS and SGG regulations. I've just got a screen shot on the slide there at the moment. So this started back in the mid-90s with the halon phase out. Initially, the focus was on ozone reduction, and halon was a very high ozone depleter. So the industry in the 90s and early 2000s transitioned away from halon to primarily HFC and inert gases. And the HFCs, bringing the second part of the ODS and SGG, they're synthetic greenhouse gases. And that's been more of the focus in the last 10 years or so because while they don't have ozone depleting potential, they do, if released to the atmosphere, still significantly contribute to global warming. So there's been a focus on trying to move people away from those agents. And also, I mean, the other primary focus is really about preventing unnecessary emissions. So if there's a fire, no problems, the system should go off, but we're certainly trying to limit or reduce the number of accidental emissions which may occur through a technician working on a system. And that's what these licenses are all about, aimed at reducing those sorts of emissions. So in the regulations themselves, there's clause 322 is specifically about these EAHLs, Extinguishing Agent Handling licenses, and it talks about qualified persons. And for license categories 1 to 5 now, we're basically only issuing qualified licenses because there are qualifications about, or units of competency available now for those license categories. Originally, when the scheme was introduced about 12 or so years ago, those units of competency were still being developed. So there was, or it still is, an experienced person's license available, but essentially they're not being issued for licenses 1 to 5 anymore. License category 6, which we'll be talking about today, you can still get an experienced person's license. So you note here that it talks about that the Fire Protection Industry Board may grant a person's license, and I'll flick over the page shortly and show you what the different categories are and the entitlements are. But the board needs to satisfy themselves that the person that's applied for the license is competent to do the units or do the category of work that's being applied for. So And you'll notice down the bottom of the screen there, it talks about specific units of competency, and these are all units of competency that have been endorsed by the National Quality Council. So the first licence we're going to talk about today is EAHL2, and that's called the Fixed System Installation and Decommissioning Licence. Essentially, it's a licence for technicians that do mechanical work on systems that contain ODS or SGG. And primarily, well, the main focus is about installing cylinders and actuation devices to the cylinders and making sure the cylinders are kept in such a manner that they're not going to be discharged accidentally. So it also talks about installing and removing transport caps and other discharge protection devices. So as I said, it's primarily focused at mechanical type work. Well, it is focused on mechanical type work. I won't read through that slide in detail, but these slides will be available on the FPIB website if you do want to have a look at them later on. So that's Licence 2. It's really aimed at those technicians that are installing ODS and SGG systems, the pipe work, actuation devices, and equipment associated with the cylinders themselves. Importantly, people installing pipe work that's remote from the cylinder, where there's no risk of an emission, accidental emission, they don't need to have a licence or an EAHL2. So EAHL3 is what you'd describe as a service or maintenance licence, and it actually involves both mechanical and electrical activities. Primarily, these systems are installed with electronic detection and actuation systems. So there'll be smoke detectors or flame detectors in the area being protected that report back to a fire control panel, which will then send a signal to the actuators fitted to the cylinders to release the system. So service technicians out in the field that service these systems would typically be of an electrical background, because most of the work that's involved in testing that part of the system is electrical. Obviously, there's a risk when you're starting to test smoke detectors and things like that, and the functions of the fire control panel, the suppression control panel, that if you don't take the right precautionary steps before you're doing that testing, i.e. removing the actuators from the cylinder, you could have an accidental discharge. So the focus of this licence is really about making sure that before any of that testing is done on the detection and actuation systems, that the actuators that are fitted to the cylinders are actually removed from the cylinders so that an accidental discharge won't occur. So this is where the overlap occurs between EAHL2 and 3 exists. They both are allowed to work on and remove and reinstall the actuators on the cylinder. However, the type of work is different. EAHL2 is installing a system originally, and the EAHL3 is your monthly testing and 6 monthly testing and annual testing of the system. But both of those activities, you need to be very careful that the actuator is not installed on the cylinder until the system has been reset and commissioned and checked to make sure that the actuators are reset. So again, I'm not going to read through all the points on the slide there. These are just extracts out of the regulations themselves. And then EAHL6, that's the Control Systems Installation, Commissioning and Decommissioning Licence, quite a mouthful. This focuses totally on the electrical detection and control systems. So the system that operates the actuator, there's somebody that's working on those in terms of commissioning, setting up the system originally, or making any changes to the way the system operates in the fire and the suppression control panel. That person needs to have this license category 6. However, this person, if that's the only license category they hold, they are not permitted to remove or reinstall the actuator on the cylinder. So that's the big difference between licenses 2, 3 and 6. 2 and 3, they can touch the actuator, install it and remove it from the cylinder. EAHL 6 is not allowed to do that work. He can do all the other work, but unless he has also a 2 or 3, he can't remove the actuator or reinstall it on the cylinder. So that's what's in the regulations, and what's in the regulations is not necessarily as clear as it could be for technicians and people working in the industry. So the Fire Protection Industry Board a number of years ago spent a lot of time and effort developing a good practice guide, which basically mirrors the requirements that are specified in the regulations and puts it into terminology and language that's a little bit easier to understand, and also aligned with the sorts of activities that technicians undertake out in the field. So again, this is available on the Fire Protection Industry Board website, which is www.fpib.com.au. So I really commend any technicians that is working on these systems or has an interest in these systems to download this document, because it's a very useful guide. And it's broken up into sections and covering the different parts of the regulations. In terms of what we're talking about today, I'm going to dive straight into the sections that are relevant to what we're talking about for licenses 2, 3 and 6. And the first section that is relevant to that is section 5, and that talks all about the installation and decommissioning of gaseous fire suppression systems which contain ODS and SGG. So again, you'll just read here. So that's on this page is just an extract out of the Good Practice Guide. It's virtually just a rehash of the words that are in the regulations themselves, just to tell you what you're allowed to do. So it talks about installing and disconnecting actuation devices and so on, interconnection devices, installing and disconnecting the containers and so on, and attaching the safety transport devices to the containers to make sure they're safe for transport. Now, section 5.2 talks specifically about installation, and this is where it gives you hopefully a little bit clearer language as to what is required if you're installing a system that contains ODS and SGG. So essentially, it says that if you're doing any installation work or making any additions to an existing system and that contains ODS and SGG, these work can only be completed by technicians who hold a EAHL 2. And as I said before, in the note, it's explained in the note there, people that are doing installation work on pipe work that is not directly connected to the cylinder or actuation devices, they don't require a license. It's only those people that are actually physically handling the cylinders, the cylinder valve, and the actuators that are attached to the cylinder valve that need EAHL 2 for installation. I guess the other thing just worth recapping as well, that not all gases that we use in gaseous fire protection are ODS and SGG. So these licenses are only required for those people that are working on systems such as FM200 is a common trade name and probably the most common SGG that's used in the Australian marketplace. NAF-S3 was another one. Halon, obviously, as I was mentioned before, that still is around in some essential uses. But if you're talking about gases like the inert gases or CO2 system, those aren't ODS and SGG, so technicians don't require a license if working on those systems. However, I mean, the same good practice really applies regardless. The good practice guide is relevant for all systems, but it's not a requirement under the law to have a license if you're working on inert gases and CO2 and those types of systems. So section 5.3 talks about commissioning, and basically this is, I guess, where a little bit of the overlap occurs, or confusion occurs between licenses 2 and 3. So it says up at the top there that any system that's being commissioned must be commissioned by technicians that holds either a EAHL or an EAHL 3. And why is that? Well, the answer is because when you're commissioning the system, the last thing you want to do once you've done all the checks is to install the actuator on the cylinder to make the system live. And obviously before you want to do that, you want to make sure that the system's being completely reset, and you want to make sure the actuators are reset so that when they are installed in the cylinder, you're not going to have an accidental discharge, and the system's right to go. Just a note there for commissioning of electrically actuated systems, that needs to be done by the technician with a license category 6, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail later on. But the technicians that are installing the actuators on the cylinder, they need to hold a 2 or 3. So the license 6 category would do all their commissioning work. License 2 or 3 holder would then check the actuators had been reset and place them on the cylinders. Okay, maintenance. Obviously, or not obviously, but maintenance should be conducted in accordance with 1851, AS 1851. Section 7 is a special hazards section, and that covers the gaseous systems. And the first requirement we have here is highlighted in yellow there, that before we do any maintenance work, it's very important that the actuators are removed from the container valves to prevent accidental discharge of the system. Importantly, and it's highlighted in the note there, that operating an isolate switch, a maintenance isolate switch on the panel, new suppression control panels are required to have that under the Australian standards. Operating that switch in itself doesn't satisfy the requirement under the regulations. The regulations require us to make the system completely safe, and that means that the actuators need to be removed by the cylinder, removed from the cylinder. And as I sort of explained before, it's highlighted there in the yellow again. Person with license 3 can undertake both the electrical and mechanical maintenance activities associated with the system, but a person with a license category 2 is only permitted to undertake the mechanical maintenance activities involving the installation and disconnection of the actuation devices and any interconnections between the cylinders. The other thing that's probably worth pointing out is if you've got a system that's mechanically activated, it might have pneumatic heat detectors or fusible links or something like that. That sort of system, the license 2 would cover all the requirements for what the work needs to be done, and you wouldn't need to have a license category 3 or indeed a license category 6 to work on or commission that system. So, but those systems aren't very common. Most systems do have electrical detection and control. As we said before, highlighted in the second column there, after the maintenance activities have been undertaken, a technician either with a license 2 or license 3 is the only person that's permitted to refit the actuators onto the system. And importantly, they should make sure that the actuators have been reset before reinstating them. Okay, at the end of the life of a system, often that'll happen as a room that was being protected may have had valuable equipment in it, IT equipment and so on, that's been moved to another facility or smaller facility, so the system's no longer needed. There's a need to decommission the system. While the system may not be needed anymore, it's very important that we make sure that the cylinders and control system is treated or handled appropriately to make sure that that agent can be kept in the cylinders and returned to a trading authority holder to decant the gas and recover it for hopefully for use again in another system. But in terms of the decommissioning requirements, and this is for both electrical and mechanical systems, that work on the cylinders, removing the cylinders, making sure all the transport caps are fitted and the locking devices are fitted, the actuators are removed safely, and so on. That work needs to be done by a license holder with category 2. So license 3 is not permitted to do that work. Okay, so a good practice guide, section 6, talks about the fire detection, actuation and control system. Section 5 was really about the suppression system itself, the cylinders and pipe work and discharge nozzles and so on. Section 6 of the good practice guide is focused on the detection, actuation and control systems. And this is where license category 6 comes in. In the first paragraph there, it's quite explicit in stating that if you're installing a new system or making modifications to an existing electrical detection, actuation and control system that's fitted or controlling an ODS and SGG system, that work needs to be undertaken by a person that holds a license category 6. So that includes any panel configuration changes or any programming changes that affect how the system works. So that could be things like the air conditioning shutdown or plant shutdown in the space. Those sorts of changes can't be completed by a technician that holds only license category 3. And obviously, again, probably not obviously, but in the note there, it just specifies that before actuators are connected to the cylinders, the EAHL 6 holder needs to inspect the system before connecting or decommissioning the detection and control system. So how they connect to the cylinders is through that actuator, so that system or the detection and control system needs to be thoroughly checked and commissioned before that last step of putting the actuators on the cylinder is undertaken by either a license 2 or license 3 holder. Commissioning in section 6, same thing. I won't read through this all again, but I've highlighted the important parts. Again, all the commissioning work needs to be done by a license 6 holder for the detection and control systems, and those activities need to be completed before a license 2 or license 3 holder reinstates the actuators on the cylinder and sets the system to work. In terms of maintenance on the electrical detection and control systems, first step always, as we've said before, is that the actuators need to be removed, so license 2 or license 3 holder needs to do that. And again, as stipulated in section 5 before, someone that holds license category 3 is permitted to undertake the maintenance activities of both a mechanical and electrical nature on the system. However, if the technician only has license category 2, they are only permitted to undertake mechanical maintenance activities. They can't do any work on the electrical detection and control system. However, if it was a mechanical detection and control system like a fusible link system or pneumatic heat detectors, things like that, license 2 holder could do that work. If during the course of the maintenance activities it's identified that need to be some changes to the system logic or the way the system operates, and that may involve adding some extra shutdowns. There might be some new air conditioning plant installed in the space, and that needs to be configured in the suppression control panel. That work would then need to be done by a license holder with license 6 holder, as highlighted in that last paragraph there. So obviously, if you've got technicians out in the field that are working on the service and maintenance of these systems, ideally, the ideal technician would hold both or all licenses 2, 3 and 6. That may or may not be possible depending on the skill set of the technician. The next best combination would be to have technicians that have both licenses 3 and 6, because they can do all the maintenance activities, both electrical and mechanical, and they can do panel configuration changes if needed. They can't do the original installation of the cylinders and actuation connections and so on in the cylinders, though that still needs to be done with a person with a license category 2. So in terms of decommissioning an electrical detection and control system, before any of that sort of work is done, again, the safest bet is to remove the actuators from the cylinder, and that needs to be done by either license category 2 or 3. So that sort of gives you a pretty quick overview of what's involved in the different license categories. As I said before, the good practice guide, I really commend that to people to have a thorough read through. It's a really useful document. It covers everything from portable extinguishers through to decommissioning systems and disposal of agent. And it has some useful guidelines and some contact numbers and so on for the industry board if there are specific questions. The other thing I wanted just to highlight before closing up for questions is that the Fire Protection Industry Board has produced warning labels that are available free of charge for service companies and, in fact, end users to attach to both cylinders that contain ODS or SGG, or suppression control panels that control systems that contain ODS and SGG. And they're really just to remind people that if you're working on this cylinder or control panel, that you are required by law to be licensed. And so that's why there's the big warning in red. It's just a reminder that the technician does need to hold a license, and maybe other contractors on site that have in the past been accustomed to doing isolations on panels and so on, like a cleaner, if they're going in and vacuuming, they maybe have had a past practice of isolating the system before they go into a room to make sure that the smoke detectors don't go off. Well, if that system is actually controlling an ODS and SGG agent, then that cleaner is not allowed under the law to actually do that isolation on the panel unless they've got either they need license category 3. So these are really just there as a reminder. As I said, they're available free of charge. The contact details are there on the stickers. So I really commend those to people as well. Be useful having a handful of those in your service van when you're out on site. If you come across a system that isn't otherwise identified, just a really easy way to let people know that this is a system that does contain ODS and SGG. So I think that's my last slide. Oh, sorry, there is a couple more. Just again, a little bit more of the information that the Fire Protection Industry Board does is prepares a whole lot of fact sheets and information that is available online. So there's different fact sheets about decommissioning systems and if you're doing work in marine systems and so on, or in the aviation space, what are the requirements there? The good practice guide, as I've been discussing today. There's information on various stakeholder forums that I hold around the country throughout the year, and GasBag is a regular newsletter that goes to both technicians that hold these extinguishing agent handling licenses and also companies that hold extinguishing agent trading authorization. So the FPIB website is worth a visit if you're trying to chase down some information. So that's all I had as far as the formal presentation goes. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take those. If there's anyone on the line that wants to ask a question, you can either put your hand up by using that icon up in the top of the screen, or type in the chat box at the bottom right. So I'll just give you 30 seconds or so if there's any questions. Otherwise, I've got a couple of FAQs or frequently asked questions I can run through as well. Okay, well, look, it doesn't look like there's any questions, so I'll just run through a couple of other things here I was asked to run through before we came online. So there's 3 types of extinguishing agent handling licenses available. As I mentioned before, there's the qualified person's license, and that's for people that have gone through a formal assessment of their skills and competency. And that assessment is against recognised units of competency. So it doesn't mean that people actually necessarily need to do training. They just need to be undergone an assessment to make sure that their skills are appropriate for the category of licence that they have. So qualified persons licences are available now for licence categories 1 through 5. So that covers portable extinguishers. 2 and 3 we've spoken about today. 4 is for refilling and decanting ODS and SGG from containers. License 5 is for warehousing, so people that are tasked with making sure that this agent is stored appropriately. And then there's license category 6, which is probably the most onerous one in terms of the competency requirements. That currently is still available as an experienced person's license, but we do have a number of people that have transitioned to the qualified license for that. So the experienced person's license, that was the original license category introduced, and that was to allow people that have worked in the industry for a period of time that have had appropriate work experience to be able to get a license to continue their work, continue working on these systems. But in the course of time, the fullness of time, that category will cease to be, or there'll be no new licenses issued under that category, because there'll be an expectation that all people have either gone through the formal training or been assessed against the competencies to make sure that they have the skills appropriate to the work that they're doing. The third category of license is if there's somebody new coming into the industry or an apprentice, they can apply for a trainee license, and that allows for trainees to handle or work on systems that contain ODS and SGG. However, they must only work on these systems while under the supervision of a license holder that has either a qualified or experienced license category. So, unfortunately, regardless of how long people have worked in the industry, there is a requirement to have a license. So, I mean, when this was first introduced, there certainly many people that have been working on gaseous systems for 20 plus years, and I guess it's a little bit of an affront when you've been working on systems for so long to be suddenly told that you now need a license, but unfortunately that's the case. So regardless of the amount of experience you've had in the industry, if you are working on systems that contain ODS and SGG, you're required by law to have a license. Just a reminder, as I mentioned before, that those people that are working on systems that contain inert gases, so inogen, argonite, carbon dioxide, water mist systems, or indeed any other suppression system that is not an ODS and SGG, you don't actually need to have an EAHL. It's only for people or technicians working on systems, scheduled agents. Hopefully I've gone through and explained the differences between license categories 2, 3 and 6. One of the as I mentioned a moment ago, license category 6 is probably the most onerous in terms of the qualifications needed or to obtain that license. So if you're applying for an EAHL 6 control systems installation, commissioning, decommissioning license, the applicant must hold an electrician's license or an appropriate cabler's registration, and that requirement is necessary to ensure that electro-technology regulations governed by other bodies are not breached. And in addition to those requirements is obviously an assessment of the competency. There's quite a few other units of competency that are in that license. So licenses are now available in terms up to 3 years. So applicants or people renewing the license now have the ability to specify if they want to renew their license for 1, 2 or 3 years. And that's to allow a little bit greater flexibility. You might have someone that's close to transitioning out of the industry or retiring, and they don't want to spend the money for a 3-year license because they're only going to be working for another year. So those options are available now. I won't go into the actual dollar figures for each of those, but obviously they're just proportionally for whether you're doing 1, 2 or 3 year renewal. The trainee license is only available for a 1-year period, and the intention of that is to give you 1 year to complete training and assessment for the required unit competency for the licence category that the individual has. So I think that's it from me. I'll leave it at that. So thanks very much for your time.